The greatest host came last, and they are named the Teleri, for they tarried on the road and were not wholly of a mind to pass from the dusk to the light of Valinor. In water they had great delight, and those that came at last to the western shores were enamoured of the sea. The sea elves, therefore, they became in the land of Aman, the Famari, for they made music beside the breaking waves. Hello my lovelies, the Teleri Elves, those who come last. Let's talk about the third and actually largest elven clan of the 3 OG houses of elves. If you're interested in the 2 other houses, they're added in my elven playlist. You do not have to watch them in order though, but obviously you can. You know how it goes. The history of the Teleri Elves is actually the hardest to tell, as different from the Vanyar and Noldor. They are scattered amongst Middle-earth and formed subgroups and subgroups of the original clan. I will give my best to try to explain their complicated history and add in some charts that might help or might not. Just as the other OG elves, the first Teleri Elves did awake in Cuvenin in pairs. The first of their kin were Enel and his wife Enelje. Together with 72 other elves, they later became the original Teleri Elves, also known as the Neljar, which means 3 or third basically. As I mentioned before, they were the last to awake, but the largest in numbers right from the beginning. How so? In my Vanyar video, I tried to explain especially the first elf to awake, Imin of the Vanyar, was very reluctant in choosing elves to add to his clan. He basically refused to add awakening elves he came across and was waiting for the perfect match and fit to add to his clan. The Noldor were not as picky, but still, they as well tried to add those awakening elves that seemed most like them. My best guess is this was mainly based on their physical appearance, and that probably was given by Eru, the one god in Tolkien's world. So he actually was the one that decided how many Vanyar, Noldor and Teleri would come into this world, no? At least to me it seems like that. The Teleri, being so many and a bit randomly added in a way, foreshadows what will happen later on. They were the largest in numbers, yes, but they were not as close in hearts and minds amongst their own as the 2 other clans. During the Great Journey West, they were the elves that did not stay together, nor did they keep their ranks closed. The Teleri clan literally was scattered amongst the known world right from the beginning. Partly, I think their king was to blame for it. Elwes Ingolo was not the king or leader. The other 2 kings to the elven clans were. He was not determined to make it back to Aman. Elwe, or King Thingol, he will later be called, did see the light on the bliss of Valinor and Aman, but unlike the 2 other elven leaders, he never went back there. Yes, he started his journey with his people to the Undying Lands from Cuvenin, so obviously he must have told his kin of the riches and the beauty of the Undying Lands. But he never made it back, and yes, he stopped halfway through the journey because he did fall in love, and not because he decided not to go. Still, he always could have gone there. He could have picked up the journey again and follow his brother's footsteps and just go west. His new wife, who was a Maiar, was even born in Aman. Yes, Melian loved Middle-earth and was there to preserve and nurture the lands, but she would not have hesitated to follow her husband, I'd say. Obviously, I know it is way more complicated, and we will get to this a bit later. What you should take away from this, and what I will prove all over this video, is the Teleri are the elves whose hearts and minds never truly were set to the west. Their hearts loved the water and always yearned for it, but also the lands and the woods, which Tolkien shows us in the subgroup of the Teleri Thranduil's people, the Woodland Realm. When some of them finally reached the Promised Realm, they loved the gods and their undying lands and the powers and might that was promised to them less than they loved the place of their birth. I feel it was especially the sea they loved. And the sea, we will later on see, was where they mostly dwelt. And what is the sea, or what is a river? It is a dividing element of lands. So their hearts were always torn between the undying lands of the gods and the lands of their birth. Therefore, they were neither here or there fully. And just like their hearts that were torn, they were scattered all over the places, and there was not one king or one true kingdom of the Teleri Elves. In a way, this is very much like the many tribes during various migrations in Europe, for example. Till this day, their heritage is not just of one place, and they are not just one race, but rather divided into various subgroups, and their oral history tells of their travels and hardships. Until this day, they keep those memories alive. Very similar, if you ask me. Let's finish off our series with a sundering of the elves with some numbers, because I love numbers. Just kidding. But let's go back there for a second, because this is really important. So, there were 144 OG elves that did awaken Cuivennen, and although our story just tells us about what happened to the ones that did start the journey west, there were elves that stayed behind and did not choose to follow their kings and Orome. Those were the called Avari, the unwilling. From the 144, 56 actually decided not to go and stay behind. That is actually a quite high number. And if you think of it and make the number of the elves actually leaving the west a smaller one than I originally remembered. If you now do the math and how many elves we had in the First Age at the height of their power, there must have been lots and lots of Avari living across Middle-earth. I will explain all the sub-clans in a minute. So, we have 74 Teleri, including their two kings Elwe and his brother Olwe. 46 of those went on the journey. 28 stayed behind, so a bit more than a third of the Teleri never even started the journey. The remainers loosely followed Morwe and Norwe as their kings. It is not known of which house they were, but as it were 28 Teleri and 28 Noldor that stayed behind, and we do not know of any Vanyar, I guess they were of the firstborn Noldor and Teleri. Note, it were half of the Noldor that stayed behind, actually a bigger number than the Teleri. But enough of numbers now. Let's talk about all the subgroups, and this gets complicated now, and therefore it would help if you take a close look at the family tree of the elves. So, we have the OG 74 Neljar. 46 of them went on the great journey and became the Teleri Elves. 28 refused to follow their kings and the invitation of the Valar and became the Avari. Let's start with them. First of all, note, they are not of the Eldar. If you have come across that name, those were only the ones willing to go west. So if you hear something like the Eldar days, Eldar history, this is just including the stories and the history of the ones that started the journey to the Undying Lands. Sorry for saying journey in literally every sentence. The Avari then split up and formed at least 6 tribes we know of. Those 6 were the Prepare, I will butcher this is really complicated. Those 6 tribes were the Kindi, Quint, Uenti, Windan, Kinlai and Penny. The 6 or possibly more tribes started to explore the lands and slowly left their birthplace, Cuivennen. Some of them formed sub-elven groups with Teleri that stayed behind on the way west and mingled with them. For example, the Noldor elves beyond the Misty Mountains. They later became the Sylvan Elves, the elves that Thranduil's father took kingship over, being a Sindar himself. Some of the Avari possibly settled in the lands of their former king Thingol in Beleriand and his kingdom Doriath, but we do not know if they really mingled or stayed amongst themselves. It is also noteworthy that none of the Avari ever made it further west than the Misty Mountains till the end of the Third Age. A last thing about the Avari. Most likely they are the source of the Orcs. Melkor most likely created the Orcs by torturing elves he did capture. Probably did not follow the trails of the elves going westwards, so he used the Avari that stayed behind as a source. This is now nowhere confirmed, but it makes sense. Morgoth could not create from scratch himself. Everyone besides Eru, Tolkien's god, is simply a sub-creator in this world. So he needed a source. To make this easier, he poisoned their minds against the Valar and made them out to be the baddies. So it probably wasn't even that hard to begin with to capture them, torture them, and thereby create the race of orcs. Enough of the Avari now, let's come to the Teleri. 46 of the 74 went on the journey, as I mentioned. They were led by 2 kings and more loosely organized as the rest of the elven clans. They split again, and it is shown they choose 2 kings instead of 1. The first host to stay behind were the Noldor, who later split up in more subclans. They felt comfortable and at home along the river Anduin and its vales. Lenwe of the Teleri became their leader. Some of them preferred to stay close to the Anduin. Some explored the lands further and settled across Eriador. Lenwe's son, Denethor, not that Denethor, had to resettle his people of the Noldor back to safe lands as they were plagued by evil spirits and creatures of Melkor. Therefore, he followed the invitation of his former lord Thingol, now king of Doriath, and they settled in Beleriand. They later became known as the Legrim, and after losing their king Denethor in the wars of Beleriand against Morgoth, they became known as the Grey Elves and took no king after Denethor's death. After the Noldor split up from the OG host of the Teleri, another group stopped their journey west, due to another reason though. One of their kings, Olwe Singolo or Thingol, these elves had so many names, people, he did disappear. No one knew what happened to the king, but they decided not to abandon him and settled in the lands of Beleriand. I do not want to go too deep into the life of Thingol, king of Doriath, but some facts are important to the story. Thingol, amongst the other 2 kings of the elven clans, Ingwe of the Vanyar and Finwe of the Noldor, did follow Orome to the Undying Lands, and did see the light of the 2 trees of Valinor. He therefore is the only Sindar that is actually a light elf. All his people were dark elves. They never completed the journey west. And by the way, Thingol's people became the Sindar elves. That group of elves was one of the largest hosts that did settle and not continue to go west. They also were called the Grey Elves of Beleriand, as I told you. Beleriand was the land they settled in. Thingol, wandering back to the settling of the Teleri, coming from a meeting with his friend and king of the Noldor, Finwe, wandered one day across the forest of Nan Elmoth. There, he made an encounter that would change his life. The fate of the Teleri, and actually the fate of the world. He met Melian the Maya. Melian served the Valar, Vanya and Este. She loved all birds and is said to have taught the nightingales how to sing. Music followed her everywhere. She also had a deep love for the forest, which she shared with Yavanna and the Valar, queen of the earth. Melian was like all Maiar from Aman, but she loved Middle-earth, and the growing nature after the sun did rise for the first time. Encountering the magical being, Thingol must have come across several Maya and even Valar, having been in the Undying Lands. He fell in love on the spot with a beautiful magical being. The same must have happened to Melian. Like him, she must have encountered elves before Thingol and be aware of them. But he was said to be the tallest of all elves, and his hair was silver. So how could she not fall in love? Kidding aside, their enchantment is nothing like other spells or magic Tolkien used before. It's more the description of pure love and time standing still when you meet your person. It had nothing to do with her casting a spell on him, which I've heard people speculate on. Yes, in a way, this needed to happen for the good to triumph over evil. If Thingol wouldn't have met Melian, he probably would have led his people to the Undying Lands, and Middle-earth would have fallen into darkness without Melian protecting Beleriand over centuries. They would not have had Luthien, and Luthien would not have created the bloodline of Aragorn and the kings of Númenor, but also Elrond himself. They are in fact all descendants of the king of Doriath, and therefore have Teleri or Sindar blood. As I said, time stood still for the 2 lovers, and after 200 years, they decided to leave the forest. I guess time works differently when you're in love. Meanwhile, the Teleri and Beleriand have split up again. Thingol's brother did lead a big chunk of the host further west. More on them a bit later. But many decided not to abandon their king and the lands they did settle in. The remaining Teleri became the Grey Elves, the Cinder Elves of Beleriand, and they lived in Thingol's kingdom of Doriath. In union with the dwarves of Belegost, Thingol created the halls of Menegroth, a beautiful hidden city that withstood evil till the First Age. His new wife, being a powerful magic user, created a magic girdle that protected all the lands. And together they had a daughter, half Maiar, half elf. She would become the most beautiful being in all the world and would play a part in defeating evil. Spoiler, the blissfulness of the Cinder didn't last and the kingdom did fall. Actually, not directly through the hands of the Dark Lord himself, but due to getting involved in the fate of the Silmarils, the War of the Jewels, and the doom of the Noldor. Again, this would be too detailed to tell this story, but remember I told you Thranduil's father Orofer was originally a Cinder from Beleriand, and him and his son were amongst the few survivors of the fall of Beleriand in the First Age. They then went east and took over a clan of the Sylvan Elves, the Woodland Realm, and became their kings, not actually being Sylvan Elves themselves. My guess is Orofer as well as Thranduil must have been kin to Thingol, maybe an unknown descendant either of his two younger brothers Elmo or Olwe, but I have zero proof of that. Just if someone becomes king, they are mostly from a royal house or line. Orofer and later Thranduil copied Thingol's halls and caves, and when you watch The Hobbit you can get a feeling how Menegroth might have looked like. Thingol's youngest brother Elmo, by the way, is the grandfather of Celeborn, Galadriel's husband. Galadriel herself is closely related to Thingol, as his brother Elwe is her maternal grandfather. I told you it's super complicated. Olwe gave up on waiting for his brother, who he thought lost, aka he really wanted to reach Aman, I guess. The last group of the Teleri, heading west, split up again. Waiting for the floating island that had been shipping the elves to the Undying Lands, the Teleri settled in the Bay of Valar and befriended Osse, a vassal of the Valar Ulmo, Lord of the Sea. You might have heard of their Lord Círdan, the shipwright, the only elf with a beard. He did not become their king, that was still Thingol, but he became a powerful lord and built the Grey Havens, which you might remember as the haven where all the elves to depart for the Undying Lands in the Third Age. The whole realm of the Falathrim was of the highest importance, as it was a kind of a junction between Middle-earth and the Undying Lands, basically heaven and earth. Fun fact about Círdan, well, I again have zero proof, but I think he was one of the OG elves of the 144 born in Cubenon, and that actually makes him the oldest elf and human beings in Middle-earth at the end of the Third Age. All other OG elves died or lived in the Undying Lands. Maybe that's why he is the only elf with a beard. That elf has seen it all. The Falathrim are counted amongst the Sindar. Short note here, after the fall of Beleriand, they had to leave their settlements because they were no longer safe there, and the survivors again were scattered amongst Middle-earth. Some settled near Lindon, whose king was a Noldor though, and spoiler, the Noldor and the Teleri have a complicated and bloody history, which I will explain in the next part. Let's come to the last group of the Teleri, the Falmari. They, in fact, were the only ones that reached the Undying Lands of Aman. They took Olwe as their king. But I told you in the beginning, they said so many goodbyes and lost family and friends and kin all over Middle-earth, so their hearts never fully accepted the Undying Lands, and they in a way still felt close to their lost kingsmen all over Middle-earth. Osse anchored the island that had now shipped all remaining elves to Aman in the Bay of Eldamar and became Tol Eressëa. They learned how to build ships and build the swan haven of Alqualonde. Obviously, they finally went to Aman, but unlike the other elven clans, they never wished to live inland. They preferred to be close to the sea. Middle-earth and not Middle-earth and their kin inside. Let's fast forward a bit to the flight of the Noldor. After the Noldorian High King Finwë was killed by Melkor and Ungoliant, his son Fëanor swore an oath to revenge his father's death and go after him and the Silmarils the duo had stolen. Melkor did flee back to Middle-earth and went into hiding. Fëanor knew the fastest way to Middle-earth was via ship. There was only one land passage at that time, and he did not dare to take on that gruesome journey. He needed to act quickly before the Noldor following him fully understood what is happening, and that they were about to be banished from the Undying Lands by the gods forever. Fëanor was friends with the Falmari and their king, not as close as his father had been, but still. They, understanding what had happened, turned down his request to get shipped to Middle-earth. Fëanor, the new king of the Noldor, sealed his faith as a kinslayer by deciding to take the ships with force. First, let's hear of his exchange with Olwe, king of the Falmari in Aman. Fëanor grew wrathful, for he still feared delay, and hotly he spoke to Olwe. "You renounce your friendship even in the hour of our need," he said. "Yet you were glad indeed to receive our aid when you came at last to these shores. Faint-hearted loiterers and well-nigh empty-handed. In huts on the beaches would you be dwelling still, had not the Noldor carved out your haven and toiled upon your walls?" But Olwe answered, "We renounce no friendship, but it may be the part of a friend to rebuke a friend's folly. And when the Noldor welcomed us and gave us aid, otherwise than you spoke, in the land of Aman we were to dwell forever, as brothers whose houses stand side by side. But as for our white ships, those you gave us not. We learned not to craft from the Noldor, but from the lords of the sea. And the white timbers we wrought with our own hands, and the white sails were woven by our wives and daughters. Therefore we will neither give them nor sell them for any league of friendship. For I say to you, Fëanor, son of Finwë, these are to us as the gems of the Noldor, the work of our hearts, whose like we shall not make again." The Teleri outnumbered the Noldor, but the Noldor, due to Melkor's teaching, were heavy armed and better prepared for battle, and so the Noldor, some fully knowing what they were doing, some just following their king's orders, and some coming in the battle lately, slayed countless Teleri Elves, friends, brothers and close kin. Fëanor's stepbrother Fingolfin and Finarfin and their Noldor host, not knowing what actually happened, came in late and partly joined the battle and basically refreshed Fëanor's forces. Fëanor is the leader and his 7 sons, but also anyone partaking in this shameful deed were banished by the Valar, never to enter the Holy Lands again. That didn't help the remaining Teleri, obviously. We don't know how many were slain, but it must have been at least a third of them, is my guess. The Noldor finally did take the ships, not enough to carry all of them over the sea, and in the end Fëanor even betrayed his own brother by burning those ships reaching Middle-earth, forcing him to choose the dangerous journey of the Helcaraxë. More on that in my Noldor video if you're interested. We have no account of what happened afterwards. The remaining Teleri rebuilt the city. We know Eärendil the Mariner and his wife Elwing did go to Alqualondë when they reached Aman, so it still existed end of the First Age. Notable is also that none of the Falmari did join in the host of the Valar and the Vanya to aid the Noldor fight the last battle against Morgoth, the War of Wrath. Understandably, in a way. 2 other events showed the deep mistrust of all Teleri against any Noldor that rooted in the kinslaying of Alqualondë. The survivors of the fall of Gondolin and Nargothrond and other remaining Noldor did settle in Lindon under the reign of their last High King Gil-galad, who was a descendant from Finarfin, Galadriel's father. Middle-earth at that time was not safe, and therefore not only Noldor sought refuge in Lindon, there was the city of Harlindon that Celeborn ruled for a time, and the survivors of Doriath. Doriath. Many Cinder Elves survivors of the fall of Doriath also settled in Lindon, but never fully accepted the Noldor king as their king. When Gil-galad called the elves of Lindon to follow him into war, the Cinder and all other Teleri living under his reign hesitated. Sadly, that led to their downfall. The War of the Last Alliance was in fact not a full alliance. Yes, Teleri also came and aided, but as I said, they did not want to be ruled by any Noldor. So Thranduil's father, Orofer, for example, called an early charge at Sauron's troop at the Battle of Dagorlad, because, like many Teleri, he did not want it to be led by a Noldor general or even a king. So he and many Cinder Elves lost their lives in the battle, one of the reasons being not wanting to communicate with the Noldor king. So let's sum this up. The Teleri, or the Third Born, were the largest host right from the beginning of days. Sadly, also right from the beginning of days, they split up. Not always by choice, yes, but I can't help but feel they always were a loose group of individuals. Still, they had till the end of days a lot in common, and did acknowledge even the furthest relative. Probably every Sylvan Elf at one point knew what happened in Aqualonde to their kin, and shunned everything Noldor. So even being divided by lands and oceans, they did stay close in ranks in some ways. Remember, Legolas coming to Lothlorien, he knew these elves were his kin, although they must split up centuries ago. He felt at home, and a strong bond to the elves under Galadriel's rule, maybe a distant relative of him. I like the thought of them being divided and connected at the same time. Still, I feel they are the clan that seems to be the most affected by the sundering of the elves after their birth. So that was it. That was my video and last video in the Elven Clan series, the video about the Teleri. I hope you enjoyed this, and yeah, if you did, please leave a like. I know this is super annoying me saying it, but it helps the channel. I really want to grow the channel and give you more epic lore videos and live streams, so please leave a like and a comment. Thank you, my lovelies. Till the next one. Bye bye.